It's forced induction day. We got whistlers, whiners, suckers. Welcome to Hoss and Pepper Garage. So in order to gain some reference as to what we're about to discuss today, let's start with the naturally aspirated engine. Now folks, in most cases a naturally aspirated engine is as plain and dull as the roll-up door behind me. There's really nothing to see. It's just an engine. There's nothing exciting about it. So to basically describe naturally aspirated is just as it sounds. It's aspirated naturally. So the only amount of pressure on the intake is the atmospheric pressure. So same as me, I'm naturally aspirated. So that's not very exciting. There's nothing forcing air into the engine to make more power. So it relies on the pistons going up and down, and essentially when the intake valve opens and the piston is going down, it's sucking air into the cylinder. So in essence, if you have a naturally aspirated engine, it just sucks. Now sure, you can put cams in it and things like that and make it sound kind of cool, but you can do all of that to a forced induction engine as well. So not only do you get the lope, but you also get the glorious turbo whistle or the supercharger whine all at the same time. So let's think about it in terms of food. You got your tooted up naturally aspirated engine. You got your headers, you got your heads, you got your cams. It's like a really, really good cheeseburger. But what makes a really, really good cheeseburger better? Bacon. I don't care what it is, bacon makes everything better. Turbos and superchargers. Bacon for your engine. Get a little whistle. So in this example, folks, we've got us a turbo diesel. Now this one is a single turbo setup, and we've got our turbo spooler upper right back there in the back. Now the benefits to the turbo is obviously the boost. So you're actually forcing air into the intake. You're cramming it in there. The more boost you shove in there with the more fuel, the more power you make. The nice thing about that is you can have smaller displacement engines that under boost, under load, create considerably more power than its naturally aspirated version. Now of course turbos are known for their glorious whistle. Everybody loves to hear the whistle, they love to hear the blow off valves, all of that cool stuff. How does that go? I'm not sure how that goes. It didn't really sound right. My sound effects is not up to snuff, but I think you get the idea. And there's different variations of turbo setups. Like I said, this one being a single turbo, you've got twin turbos, you've got sequential turbos, you've got inline turbos, all different kinds for doing different things. So with a turbo, you essentially have two parts of it. There's one half where the exhaust flows through it to spin the turbine that will spool the axle and spin the turbine on the other side for the intake. And basically, the spinning of that creates the boost that crams air off into your motor. The benefit to a turbo is that it's essentially using the exhaust to spool the turbo. So it's not any parasitic drag on the engine itself per se. One of the challenges with turbos is the exhaust, routing the exhaust to the turbo. If you're trying to convert a naturally aspirated engine to a turbo, then you essentially have not only the intake portion of it, but also the exhaust portion of it that must be done in order to route the exhaust to the turbo. And there's varying ways of doing that as well, just depending on what turbo setup you have. Another challenge with turbos is what's called turbo lag. So essentially it's the time that it takes for the exhaust to spool the turbo up. The bigger the turbo, the more time it takes to spool it up. So you have to take that in consideration. That's why there's different variations of turbo setups. Some are designed to reduce turbo lag, the variable vane turbos, the twin turbos. You may have two smaller turbos that spool up faster, things like that. The sequential, that essentially one turbo is feeding into another turbo to spool it up faster. There's all kinds of theories. Another challenge with turbos is its EGTs, exhaust gas temperature. So basically, the more exhaust you put in, the faster that the turbo spools. The more that the turbo spools, the more boost is made, the more air is crammed in the engine. The more you do that, the more you raise the temperatures. And then it goes into the exhaust hotter than it was before. So essentially the turbo, if gone unchecked, EGTs will go through the roof and you can essentially melt down your engine. If you've got a turbo car that you're running at the drag strip or something like that, you know, you've got 10-15 seconds of boost and then it's over with. With something like this, an OG73, where he's made the tow, you're talking hours. If you're in a hilly or mountainous region where you have long durations of boost to move that heavy load, then you definitely have to keep an eye on your EGTs. Another piece of equipment that you'll generally find on turbo engines are intercoolers. Basically, when the air going into the intake comes out of the turbo, it's hot. You've got the exhaust flowing right next to it, heating up the turbo, so as it goes through there and you're forcing all this air, it generates heat. So the intercooler comes in between the turbo and the intake. So you'll basically have intake tubing routed. You'll have an intercooler up front somewhere in most cases, so that the ambient air can cool that intake charge, and then it will come back around and go into the intake. If you were to add a turbo system to a naturally aspirated, you obviously have the turbo, you have the exhaust components, you have the intake components with the intercooler. It's going to require more fuel, so you'll have fuel requirements, whether that's a beefed up fuel pump, beefed up injectors, possibly fuel rail, depending on how big you're going. But it can be a little pricey. So now we're talking supercharger. This is where you get the glorious whine associated with superchargers. It's something like that. I'm not probably didn't sound very good. And the concept is still the same. It's just cramming air into the intake to increase boost and horsepower. There's different variations of supercharger. You have Roots type, you have twin scroll, you have centrifugal, you have different options for that as well. The nice thing about the Supercharger, especially the Roots and twin scroll type superchargers, is the boost is instant. It's driven off of a pulley on the motor. So basically, as soon as the motor RPMs go up, the supercharger RPMs go up, creating instant boost. So you get that instant torque. There's no lag whatsoever, and it can make a lot of power. Now, the advantage to the supercharger being driven by the engine is the instant torque. However, the disadvantage is that it takes power to turn the supercharger. So it's a parasitic loss in order to make the boost. Some of the equipment associated with supercharging. It has a liquid intercooler that's cooling the charge temperature. That intercooler, liquid intercooler, has a heat exchanger. So you have coolant that's routed through a heat exchanger that's on the front end of the vehicle that cools the liquid, much like the intercooler on the turbo cools. So you're cooling the liquid as it goes through the heat exchanger into the intercooler, and it's reducing that charge temperature. On a centrifugal, it may be a very similar setup as the turbo. It's basically may come out and go through an intercooler on the front of the vehicle prior to it going into the intake. So as far as ease of installation, the superchargers have a lot of commonalities with the turbos, with the exception they don't necessarily require exhaust work. Now, long tube headers and things like that can definitely improve the efficiency of the engine as a whole, especially with the supercharger, but it's not required in order for the supercharger to work. Like I said, you do have a pulley and everything associated with the supercharger. One of the quick and easy things with the supercharger is your pulley essentially determines your boost level. So you have the drive pulley down below, and then you also have your supercharger pulley. So the size of those pulleys determine how fast the supercharger turns, which in turn determines how much boost you have. Now, you can reach limitations and efficiency issues trying to spin some of these superchargers too fast, but that's the basic concept. Now, we mentioned centrifugal. So basically a centrifugal supercharger is basically half of a turbo. So instead of an exhaust turbine on one end, you have a pulley. So it can be mounted over on the side and be driven off of your pulley system. So not quite as efficient as far as instant torque, just because the position of these types of superchargers is directly on the intake. With the centrifugal, you're going to have piping and things like that. So a lot of manufacturers do provide entire kits. So if you were to upgrade your naturally aspirated engine, aka the sucker, to turbo or supercharger, they provide entire kits, including the tuning and all of that associated with that, and it will be in most cases specific to your application, whatever you're driving. So that's definitely the way to go. They've taken all the guesswork out of it. You'll also have technical support and all that kind of stuff associated with that specific kit on your specific application, and they can help you through all that instead of trying to fumble through and figure out how everything goes and why it doesn't work. So easiest way, purchase one of those kits. In one weekend you can be whistling and whining all the way down the road with a trail of tire smoke behind you. Well, that about does it, folks. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, life is too short to drive naturally aspirated. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.